Please be seated. Veuillez-vous asseoir.
Prosecution, I understand you're continuing. I'm not sure who's speaking at this point, though. Monsieur Duterte?
Je continue sur ma lancée, Madame la Présidente.
Mr. Duterte. Yes, I shall continue
Just
on
to
your own.
remind you that you have approximately 35 minutes remaining at this point to finish your submissions. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
Mr. Duterte, thank you, Your Honor.
Je me tiendrai à ce timing.
I shall strive to meet that timing.
J'ai évoqué, Madame la Présidente, Madame la juge, Monsieur le juge,
Presiding Judge, Your Honours, I have sketched out in detail Al Hassan's role and his different, the different functions which he fulfilled over the course of Hakim and Ansardine's occupation of Timbuktu. I also dealt in some detail with the gravity of the offences committed, and I also characterized the circumstances, the aggravating circumstances to those acts. And to be very clear at this stage and to summarize things, the prosecution has identified 5 different circumstances: the zeal, the number of victims, the vulnerability, lack of defense of these individuals, the particular cruelty of the acts perpetrated, and the discrimination brought to bear. So the remainder of what I have to say deals with the gravity of the issues. And therefore there will be no counting in double of anything. And I note that the defence very kindly provided 3 annexes to us at 9:01 this morning. I would request that these be removed from the file. We are supposed to be making or offering oral submissions today and not written submissions, whereas these documents have been provided at the absolute last minute by way of ambush, and also has consequences regarding the time allotted to the 2 parties to provide their final submissions. We had clearly an allotted period of time, and these annexes are on top of that. So I would now like to address a number of factors and circumstances which the defence will be addressing as regards attenuating circumstances. Now, I would like to ensure the Chamber that I will not be exhaustive, and I will only spend the necessary amount of time on these matters. So, in this case, there are no attenuating circumstances when it comes to Mr. Al Hassan. And the defence's arguments either have no basis in law or they are simply irrelevant. I will take some examples because they will illustrate how the defense is making statements which are not based on any fact and may be misleading indeed to the Chamber. Now, I will leave to one side the matter of Mr. Al Hassan's current state of health linked to COVID-19 and the alleged post-traumatic syndrome due, it is alleged, to his time in detention in Mali. These are things which have absolutely no link to the proceedings here at the ICC. We have already explained this in detail in writing. As regards the matter of Mr. Al Hassan's current state of health, we would refer you to the Anguen decision on the matter. And to your recent decision, number 2639. So I shall focus on simply on the defence's allegations regarding Mr. Al Hassan's alleged cooperation. It's pretty instructive, I think you'll find, as I proceed.
La défense évoque tout d'abord la
So,
coopération
first of
de
all,
M. Al Hassan.
the defense refers to Mr. Al Hassan's cooperation of the convicted person.
Je dois dire, on a beau retourner la procédure dans votre chambre dans tous les sens,
Now, we have
on ne voit aucun signe de coopération de M.
examined in detail, inside and out,
Contraire,
the
M. Al Hassan,
proceedings
loin de
here
coopérer avec
before
l'accusation,
your chamber,
s'est
and we
opposé
see no
systématiquement à l'accusation dans
no
tout le procès.
trace of cooperation by Mr. Al Hassan. Quite on the contrary, Mr. Al Hassan has been far from cooperative with the prosecution. And he has systematically stood against the proceedings. Yes, of course, he did give an interview in 2017, but that was before the pretrial chamber issued an arrest warrant for him in March 2018. Since then, for 6 consecutive years, Mr. Al Hassan has shown a total and persistent lack of cooperation.
Il s'est ainsi opposé de façon la plus ferme à ce que son
He
interview de 2017
therefore objected in the strongest possible terms to his 2017 interview being entered into evidence before this chamber.
L'accusation n'a même pas pu obtenir un
The
seul
prosecution
fact
has
qui ne
not
serait-ce
even
que
been
sur son
able to
naissance,
secure a
sur
single
son naissance.
agreed fact from him, not even about the place of his birth or his his profession
Conteste même l'existence d'un conflit
as
armé au Nord Mali.
a pharmacist. Al Hassan even denies the existence of an armed conflict in northern Mali. Now, every Malian knows that there has been armed conflict in Mali since 2012. All anyone has to do is
On est loin, ne serait-ce que de la situation de Katanga qui a témoigné longuement et fourni des détails à l'audience sociale.
we are far from the situation of Katanga, who testified at length and provided details under oath at
Alors,
his
Al Hassan
hearing,
peut
or
s'opposer
at
à
the
tout, c'est
hearing.
son droit.
Al Hassan
Je
can
reconnais volontiers.
oppose everything.
Mais on ne peut
That's
pas
his
parler
most
de
legitimate right. But we can't talk of cooperation, and that would be wrong, I believe.
Il n'y a chez Al Hassan aucune expression de remords, donc je passe maintenant au remords.
I'm now going to move on to the topic of remorse. There has been no explicit or sincere expression of remorse from Al Hassan.
Il a déposé une déclaration écrite devant votre chambre.
He submitted a written statement to
Il
the
déclare,
court,
je cite, c'est
and in
intéressant,
it he says, and I quote,
des personnes peuvent ressentir qu'on leur a fait du
people
mal,
may feel
alors qu'on n'a pas
that
réalisé qu'on a fait du mal.
they
Mais
have
s'ils
been
disent qu'on a fait du mal, alors il
hurt
faut
has been
demander pardon.
done to them when they've not realized that they have been hurt. But if they say that they have been hurt or suffered prejudice, then they must ask for forgiveness.
C'est tellement général et ambigu.
Now, this is so general and so ambiguous.
Al Hassan ne mentionne même pas
Al
Tombouctou
Hassan doesn't even mention
ou les
Timbuktu
Tombouctiennes et les Tombouctiens.
or
Al Hassan
the
ne
people of
mentionne même pas
Timbuktu.
les faits de 2012.
He doesn't even
Al
mention the
Hassan ne
events of
mentionne même pas
2012.
un seul des
He
crimes
doesn't
pour lesquels
mention
il
a
a été
single
condamné par la
crime
Chambre.
for which he has already been
Il ne
convicted
mentionne même
by
pas le
this
nom ne
court.
serait-ce que d'une
It doesn't
victime.
even mention the name of a single victim.
En un mot, il ne reconnaît pas avoir fait
In
du mal
short,
ni avoir commis des
he
crimes.
does not acknowledge having done harm or
À la vérité des remords,
having committed
on n'en
crimes.
voit pas.
In fact, there is no evidence
Et on est
of
très loin, par
remorse
exemple,
here.
de la position d'Al-Mahdi, un local de
And here, this
Tombouctou
is a
comme
far
Al Hassan,
cry from the position of Al Mahdi, who was a Timbuktu local, like Al Hassan, and who was prosecuted for the 2012 attack on the mausoleums, and who expressed direct, clear regret at trial here at the ICC in 2016.
pas de coopération, pas de remords.
So, no cooperation, no remorse.
J'en viens à la question du pardon tel qu'il est
This
développé par la défense.
Brings me to the question of forgiveness or pardoning,
La défense parle
as
de
raised by
pardon,
the
mais
defense. Now, the defense refers to forgiveness.
Premièrement, pardonner ne veut pas dire qu'il ne
But
doit pas y
be
avoir de
careful,
sanction.
even if someone is forgiven, that doesn't mean that there should not be a punishment. One needs to distinguish between morality and personal conviction on the one hand and application of the law on the
En fait,
other.
la sanction nécessaire est juste. La rétribution
In fact,
précède souvent le pardon. On verra ce que disent les
retribution
victimes,
often
mais
precedes
si je me souviens
pardon.
bien, les victimes demandent même une peine d'emprisonnement à vie.
I believe that the victims are also asking for life imprisonment in the
Clairement,
case
il
of
y a une
Mr.
distinction entre sanction et pardon.
Al Hassan. So very clearly one has to distinguish between punishment and pardon.
Deuxièmement, la défense indique que la population de Tombouctou est prête à pardonner
Secondly,
ceux
the
qui
defense
s'avancent
says that the people of
pour lui demander
Timbuktu are ready to forgive
On est dans le général, sans
those
aucun détail.
who come forward to ask for
Il y
forgiveness.
a un seul témoin
But we're talking in generalities here. There
qui
are no
mentionne un
details.
pardon de la population Al Hassan, mais quelle est sa qualité pour le dire?
It
Si on
has
renvoie à la
been
décision
said
dans l'affaire Ongwen,
that this is thought by the people there, but who does this individual speak on behalf of? And I would refer you again to the Ongwen case, where the chamber indicated that only the legal representatives of the victims can speak on their behalf.
nul doute que
Thirdly, there's no doubt that some people have certainly not forgiven.
cas de Dédé Oumaïga, amputé en
Consider the
2019
case of Dedou Maïga, who was amputated in 2012 in Timbuktu. He has since died. He did not forgive,
MLI OTP
and he said in a video, MLI OTP 00017077 at the 20th minute,
Il déclare il ne mérite pas le pardon.
there
Tous ceux qui excusent ces gens sont complices.
he says he's not worthy of forgiveness. All those people who excuse him are actually accomplices.
Au total, ces développements sont dénués de pertinence.
So,
quant
all
à
in
la
all,
détermination de la peine.
these assertions by the defense regarding forgiveness are irrelevant when it comes to sentencing.
L'accusation requiert bien effectivement un minimum de 22
The
années
prosecution
d'emprisonnement.
is indeed
Je vais pas répéter
requesting a
les
minimum
conclusions
of
qui
22
simplement
years
souligner
imprisonment.
quelques points.
I'm not going to repeat our written submissions, I shall just highlight a few points.
Qu'en est-il en termes de référence de jurisprudence antérieure?
So, what is the situation now in terms of previous case
Vous
law?
connaissez la jurisprudence Semenza,
You are aware of the Semenza case
PPIGR.
at the ICTR.
La Chambre d'appel indique
There,
les comparaisons
in
peuvent ne pas être d'une grande
the
utilité,
appeals chamber
étant donné que chaque affaire a ses propres circonstances
found
particulières.
that such a comparison may
et que
not
les
be
circonstances
said
atténuantes
that the
et
decision
aggravantes
as to the
peuvent commander des résultats
rather
différents.
such a comparison may not be of much use given that each case has its own particular circumstances and that mitigating and aggravating circumstances may
Mais ce
command
n'est
different
pas forcément que toute
results.
comparaison est forcément appropriée quand il y a des similitudes. Là aussi, l'affaire Semenza le mentionne.
Ultimately, the decision as to the length of sentences left to the discretion of the judges and depends on the particular circumstances of the case.
Donc il faut vous
So this is
focaliser
what we
sur les faits
read
particuliers de
in
l'affaire et
Semenza.
les circonstances aggravantes qui concernent M. Al Hassan.
So we
ainsi
must
que
therefore
l'absence de
focus
circonstances
on the
atténuantes. Mais il y
particularly
a quand même
serious
des
facts of the
parallèles
case
justifiés qui
and
peuvent
the
être
numerous
faits. Et je-
aggravating circumstances and the absence of mitigating factors and circumstances.
J'ai mentionné
Having
le
said
cas de
that, I would
M.
like to
Al-Mahdi,
draw the following
membre
justified
d'Al-Qaïda et d'Al-Qaïda au Maghreb
parallels.
islamique en 2012, pendant
Take the case of
l'occupation
Al-Mahdi, a member of Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda
Lui aussi est
in the
un local.
Islamic Maghreb in 2012
des
during the
mêmes lieux, de la même
occupation
période de
of
temps.
the city. He too was a Timbuktu
Et M.
local.
Al-Mahdi a été poursuivi
These
pour
are the
l'attaque
same
contre les
places, the
emprisonnés
same period of
menée pendant une
time.
dizaine de jours, soit un seul chef
Al
d'accusation,
Mahdi was
en
prosecuted
soi
for the
ne
attack
portait
carried
pas
out over a period of
sur
10 days
l'intégrité
against
physique
the
de personne.
mausoleums of Timbuktu, which did not affect the physical integrity, so to speak, of any individuals. Mr. Al-Mahdi cooperated fully from the start of the investigation and throughout his own trial. He pleaded guilty and he expressed his sincere remorse, and on the basis of these various factors, the relevant chamber handed down a sentence of 9 years imprisonment. Now, let's draw the comparison. The crimes of persecution, torture, cruel treatment, outrages upon personal dignity, mutilation, other inhumane acts, and punishments handed down without a trial by an irregularly constituted court committed by Al Hassan. These are infinitely more numerous and they affected defenseless and vulnerable people, including children, women and the elderly, and have lasted infinitely longer over time. I'm now going to refer to another case.
De M. Ongwen, dans laquelle la peine originale de 30
This
années d'emprisonnement
is
pour
the
persécution a
Ongwen
été
case,
réduite d'un tiers
in
à
which
20
the
ans,
original sentence
en raison
of
du
30
tribunal
years
auquel M.
imprisonment
Ongwen
was reduced by a third to 20 years imprisonment.
Monsieur Duterte, nous avons un petit problème.
Presiding Judge, I would like to interrupt Mr. Duterte for a moment. We have a technical issue.
Does not appear to have the English interpretation coming through. Perhaps someone could assist her? Thank you.
This is the English language interpreter.
Perhaps you could
I hope that the judge can hear the English language interpreter.
speak for a moment. We'll just test this en français.
Une citation
Mr.
du
Duterte.
poète Nazim
Yes.
Hikmet, poète turc.
A quotation from a poet.
La question n'est pas d'être captif, la question c'est de garder sa dignité.
It is a matter of retaining one's dignity.
Dans le recueil Il neige dans la nuit.
This is from the poetry compilation It is Snowing During the Night.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Duterte. Je pense que
Presiding
c'est-
Judge.
c'est d'accord.
Thank you, Mr. Duterte. I think that the problem has been resolved and we can proceed.
Thank you.
Merci. Est-ce que je dois reprendre un peu en arrière ou je...
Mr.
à partir
Duterte,
de
should
quand je
I
continue, Madame la Présidente?
actually repeat a certain section? From what point would you like me to pick up, Your Honour?
I think that's fine. You can continue. Sorry for the interruption, Monsieur Duterte.
Je vous en prie, je suis à la disposition.
Mr. Duterte, not at all. I am in your hands.
En dehors du cas d'Al-Mahdi, qui avait
So,
une
aside
charge,
from the
sans atteinte
Al-Mahdi
aux
case,
personnes,
where there
qui a
was
reçu une
one
pénalité
charge
de 9
which
ans,
did not
rien de comparable
involve
avec la
direct
multiplicité de charges
harm to
et de
individuals,
circonstances aggravantes
there's no
applicables à M.
comparison with the
Al-Hassan.
multitude
Je fais référence
of
au cas de M.
grave
Ongwen,
charges faced by Mr.
qui a
Al-Hassan.
reçu une peine originale de
I
30
have
années
also
d'emprisonnement
made
pour
reference
persécution,
to the
laquelle
Ongwen
peine a été
case,
réduite
where the
à
original
20 ans
sentence
en raison de
of
son
30
jeune
years
âge
imprisonment, which
lorsqu'il avait été enlevé.
was reduced by a third to 20 years imprisonment because of the young age at which Mr. Ongwen had been abducted.
Dans cette affaire, les accusations
Now,
de
in the Ongwen
persécution,
case,
l'affaire Ongwen,
the
incluaient les
acts
condamnations
constituting
comme dans
persecution
Al-Hassan,
included, as in the Al Hassan case,
et atteinte à la
convictions
dignité
for
de la personne.
torture and outrages upon personal dignity.
Dans l'affaire Ongwen comme dans l'affaire Al-Hassan, il y avait la circonstance
In the
aggravante
Ongwen
de
case and the
multiplicité
Al Hassan case, there was the aggravating circumstance of the large number of victims.
Mais dans les cas d'Ongwen et d'Al-Hassan respectivement, il y
But
avait
in the case
différentes
of
autres condamnations
Ongwen
sous-jacentes
and
aux
Al
crimes de persécution.
Hassan, there were different underlying crimes.
Par exemple, les condamnations pour meurtre,
Respectively.
tentative de meurtre et de pillage dans l'affaire Ongwen,
For example, attempted murder and looting in the case of
et
Ongwen,
condamnations pour
and
autres actes humains, traitement cruel,
convictions
mutilation, et sanctions prononcées sans jugement préalable par une cour régulièrement
for
constituée dans le
mutilation and judgments by illegally constituted courts
Donc,
and inhuman acts in the case of Al
certaines différences,
Hassan.
mais au-delà,
So
dans
there
le cas
are
de
some
M. Al-Hassan,
differences,
il y a une
but
circonstance aggravante additionnelle,
there were additional aggravating
le zèle
circumstances.
de M. Al-Hassan, le caractère
There
sans
are
défense des victimes et
additional
une particulière cruauté.
aggravating circumstances in the case of Al Hassan, and that is zeal, the defenseless nature of the victims, and particular
Au
cruelty.
total, mutantis mutandis, sans
All
comparable,
in all, comparing that which is more or less comparable
il n'y a rien qui
between
justifie
Ongwen and Al Hassan, there is nothing which would
aucune de
justify
persécution dans la présente affaire,
going below
à moins de 22 ans d'emprisonnement.
22 years imprisonment for the crime of persecution in this case.
Je me dois à ce stade d'aborder très
Now, at this
brièvement
stage, I
trois
must
aspects
briefly
techniques
touch
que
on
je vais évacuer le
three
plus rapidement
technical
possible.
aspects, and I'll try to get
C'est
through
un peu
those
vite,
as
j'en
rapidly
excuse,
as
mais
possible. I'm
je
going to be
préfère
very
encore.
brief, of course, but of course I need to
Le premier point
remain
technique
within my
mentionné
allotted time.
par,
The
la
first
défense dans son
technical
mémoire,
aspect was referred to by the defense
c'est lié aux
in
conditions de remise de M.
its
Al-Hassan à
brief,
la
and
Cour
it
pénale
was
internationale.
related to the conditions in which Mr. Al Hassan
Il n'y a
was
aucune
transferred
violation du
to
statut,
the International
encore
Criminal
moins
Court.
d'impact
There
en
was
termes
no
de réduction de
violation of the
peine.
statute, and there was no
Je me
impact
réfère
which would lead to a reduction in the sentence.
Au filing
And I refer to the filing
ICC-01/12/18,
I should give you the reference numbers now.
ICC-012/10 du 29 mars 2018. Les éléments nécessaires sont là.
You'll find it all in the document, the filing of the 29th of March 2018.
Donc 0112-018-10.
112 0118.
Maintenant, d'Al-Hassan, au fin d'appuyer
I
son temps de
turned
détention
now
au Mali entre
The
2017 et
argument
2018,
raised by Al
peine
Hassan regarding the time he spent in detention in Mali between April 2017 and March 2018,
soyons clairs,
and that this should count towards his sentence.
le temps de
Let
détention
us
de
be
Al-Hassan
clear.
au Mali,
The
avant sa
amount
remise à la
of
Cour,
time which was spent
non
by
lié à la
Mr. Al Hassan
procédure et
in
ne
Mali
saurait être
before his transfer to the court was unrelated to these proceedings, and therefore is unrelating to the sentence which you shall hand down.
L'arrestation d'Al Hassan par Barkhane date du 21 avril 2017.
Al Hassan was arrested by Barkhane on the 21st of April 2017.
L'accusation a pris cette arrestation par les médias en mai 2017.
The prosecution learnt of this arrest through the media around May 2017.
Mémoire 282.
And I refer to brief 982.
L'accusation a ensuite
The
interrogé Al
prosecution
Hassan comme
then
témoin
questioned Al Hassan as a witness from the 13th of July 2017
Le
onwards.
premier contact du bureau
The
du procureur avec les
first
autorités françaises
contact
date
of the
de
Office of the
novembre
prosecutor
2017
with the French authorities
pour obtenir les notes
was
d'interview
in November
faites par les
2017
autorités françaises
when
avec
we
Monsieur Al Hassan.
requested the interview notes, the notes of interviews made by the French authorities with Mr. Al Hassan.
La demande de mandat d'arrêt
The request for an arrest warrant was filed with Pretrial Chamber 1 on the 20th of March 2018,
Il a été, ce mandat d'arrêt décerné le 27
and
mars
that arrest
2018.
warrant was issued on the 27th of March 2018.
Barkhane n'a donc jamais arrêté Al Hassan en
So
avril
Barkhane
2017
did
en
not
raison d'un mandat
arrest
d'arrêt
Al
de la
Hassan in
CPI
April
délivré d'un an
2017
plus tard,
further
en
to an
mars
ICC arrest
C'est
warrant,
l'évidence.
given that that
Et le dossier
arrest warrant was
transféré
issued
des
almost a
autorités
year
françaises
later
au Malien.
in March 2018. Also, the transfer of the case
MLI
from the
0069
French authorities to the Malians, that's MLI OTP 00699939,
Et le dossier de la DGSE malienne,
and
notamment
the
0066
interview notes of the Malian DGSE,
0066-0452,
that's MLI OTP 00660452.
montre que les
Notably,
autorités françaises et maliennes étaient intéressées
this
par les activités
shows
d'Al
that the
Hassan
French
avec
and
Al
Malian
Mansour
authorities
et
were
Iyad
interested in
Al-Khali
Al Hassan's
après
activities with
2013.
Al Mansour and Iyad Al-Khali after 2013, 2014,
Aucun lien avec la présente affaire.
and that has no link with the case before you.
La défense vient à la dernière minute avec un document
At the last minute,
depuis
the
3 ans.
defense produced a document which had held for almost 3 years. That was in
Du ministère de l'Intérieur
2021. A document from the French Ministry of the Interior containing some ambiguous wording.
L'accusation ne peut pas spéculer
The
sur
prosecution
ce que
cannot
l'auteur de cette
speculate
lettre voulait
as to what the
signifier.
author of that letter
Seul
had
lui pourra le
meant
clarifier.
by that wording. Only the author
Je
could
constate
clarify
que la
that.
défense a fait le choix de ne
I
citer
note that the
personne
defense
à l'audience
has
sur ce
chosen
document.
not to call a witness to appear in this court to explain that document, and therefore we have not had an opportunity to cross-examine such an individual under oath.
Au total,
So we take note of
la détention de
how this was
Al Hassan au
handled.
Mali n'a
So,
aucun lien avec
Mr. Al Hassan's detention in Mali has no link to the proceedings before the ICC and should have no link
un
to
mot
the
rapide
sentence
sur la
which
composition de la
is issued.
Chambre et
Now,
le
just a few
remplacement
words
d'un juge.
regarding the composition of this chamber and the
Je dirais que tout délai pris potentiellement
change of or the
aucunement
matter
Al
of the
Hassan,
judges.
qui est déjà condamné, et dans la mesure où toute période de détention à la CPI entre cette audience et le moment où le jugement sur la peine sera prononcé a vocation à être pris en compte
There is no
sur le temps total qu'Al Hassan devra effectuer. Pas de préjudice.
a prejudice at all to Mr. Al Hassan in this connection. That is to say, with the replacement of a judge, no prejudice has been suffered.
Toutes ces questions un peu techniques nous ont éloignés
Not
de la
even in
réalité
relation to the period of
humaine
detention
des faits de 2012
at the
dans
ICC.
cette affaire
Now,
et des faits graves dont Al Hassan est l'auteur.
serious offences were committed by Mr. Al Hassan, and that is clear from the events which took place in 2012,
Laissez-moi finir avec le cas déchirant de
and
Dédé
which he
Maïga.
perpetrated. Now, let me just finish off with Deidou Maïga.
On est dans la matinée du 16 septembre 2012
It is the 16th of
sur
September.
l'esplanade de l'hôtel Azalaï.
September
Une foule incluant des femmes, des enfants a été rameutée
2012,
par
on the
Ansar
esplanade
Dine
near the
et accueillie
Azalai
à
Hotel.
Palestine.
A crowd, including children, women, and the elderly, has been rounded up by Ansar ad-Din and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic
Ce
Maghreb.
jour-là, Tombouctou a
That
été
day,
témoin
Timbuktu
d'une violence
had
et d'une
witnessed
cruauté
an act of
inconnue.
violence and cruelty unknown to them. an act which has sadly become emblematic for the city, whereas in a not very distant past, Timbuktu was renowned for its rich history and civilization. And here I would refer to what the deputy prosecutor said in opening this morning. We have photographs of that sad event on the 16th of September 2012. You've seen them. They're very prevalent and freely available in the file. A first photograph shows Dédéou tied to the back of a chair by a rope around his abdomen. His ankles are shackled, his head is covered by a piece of cloth, no doubt to prevent him from seeing the horror that awaits him only moments later, so that he doesn't fight back. It's revolting. And a second photograph shows the scene after the amputation. You can see the machete used to cut off Dédéou's right hand. There were streaks of blood all along the blade. On the picture, you can also see the amputated hand on one side with the splinters of bone. And on the other side, Dédéou's bloody stump. The stump is put in hot oil. It's clearly a scene of butchery. You can ascertain how frightened Dédéou was. And Sardine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb are clearly pleased. They had wanted to make an example of the people, to the people, to show their power and terrorize the town. They've done it. The message is sadly clear. And Sardine and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb stop at nothing to impose their law. One witness said that the crowd left very quickly and that the sky turned black. Another said at the hearing, and I quote, "Morale was shattered. There was little movement in the city. It was silent as a cemetery." Dédéou had been arrested for theft by two members of the Islamic police. Al Hassan was one of them. Al Hassan knew full well what the punishment was. Al Hassan also knew that the court that sentenced Dédéou was not independent in any way. In fact, Al Hassan is fully responsible for this cruelty. And in the interview on the 30th of October 2012 at the governorate, MLI OTP 00693712, he states, and I quote, "We applied rules on the thieves by cutting off their hands." End of quotation. This is a far cry from the clemency and forgiveness that Al Hassan now claims for himself. Presiding Judge, Your Honours, it's now a little over 10 years ago, in January 2013, on a day probably similar to today, that Al-Qaeda and in the Islamic Maghreb and Ansar Dine fled from Timbuktu in the face of advancing Malian troops backed by French forces. Al Hassan left with Al-Qaim and Ansar Dine. He was the last head of the Islamic police, and he knows why. And the people of Timbuktu do too. Timbuktu was liberated. Timbuktu was free. But for his part, Al Hassan continued on in the same frame of mind. In 2013, in the Tigharhar Mountains, where Aqim and Ansar Dine had taken refuge, he boasted about what he had done and about the bans, prohibitions that he had applied. Paragraph 1093 of the judgment. The defense refers to other paragraphs of your judgment on Al Hassan's state of mind, but is careful not to dwell on that paragraph, paragraph 10 93. Your Honours, 1,000 generations have made up the great history of Timbuktu, the pearl of the desert. Al Hassan has contributed, along with Hakim and Ansar Dine, to destroying that heritage. 1,000 generations to come will try to repair the scars and the damage done in that dramatic episode of 2012. But for the time being, this is the time for punishment, sanctions, a punishment based on the need for retribution and deterrence.
Rétribution et sanction par rapport auxquelles les affirmations de M. Al Hassan quant à sa réinsertion.
Mr. Al Hassan has made statements regarding his rehabilitation, but this is of limited relevance when it comes to ascertaining what retribution and deterrence is needed. I refer here to the decision in the Ntaganda case. We are talking here about war crimes. We're talking here about crimes against humanity with very serious consequences. We cannot pretend that nothing happened. Mr. Al Hassan has been responsible for abuses, violence, persecution of a people, and there must be a sanction, a heavy sanction for that. This is at the heart of the system of the International Criminal Court and its statute. Now, the Chamber will note that the rules laid down by Hakim and Islamic Maghreb and the threats and the actual violence perpetrated have been traumatizing for the people of Timbuktu who lived in a climate of fear. They were terrorized. And this all took place with the contribution of Mr. Al Hassan. Mr. Al Hassan was always present. He was there at the police from May 2012 to January 2013, whatever changes in command at the head of the police. He is the one who ensured the day-to-day running and continuity of the police, the key body of repression. No matter how hard you look, you won't find anyone in Hakim and Ansar Dine who was more involved throughout the occupation of Timbuktu from start to finish, and who was so involved in implementing the very specific religious vision of those two armed groups. Now, one final word, and I'm arriving at my conclusion. Remember the writings of Al Hassan, which I quoted earlier and which have been submitted in evidence. He said, and you will remember this, some people may feel that they have been wronged when they have not realized that they have been wronged. If we understand correctly, when DDU is amputated after having been arrested by Al Hassan does not realize that he has done any harm. When P0557 and P0565, who were minors, 14 years of age, were each beaten with 100 lashes in the presence of Al Hassan, who is securing the scene, Al Hassan does not feel he's doing any harm. When 3 couples were given a total of 600 lashes in the presence of Al Hassan in November 2012, Al Hassan never had the impression that he was harming them. All in all, we have a population, local people, women, men, children who had done nothing and asked for nothing. 2 groups arrive in to abuse them with the complicity of some locals like Al Hassan, who acted against his own sisters, against his own brother. A local prominent person said, and I quote, "All people were holed up in their houses for fear of being repressed, for fear of being humiliated, for fear of being brutalized, for fear of being beaten." For any organized bank robbery with weapons and hostage-taking that one might find in any country, the perpetrators will receive an average of no less than 12 to 15 years imprisonment in a simple national court. Your Honours, in this case, we are in another dimension. This is on a different scale. A whole population has been taken hostage with a planned, organised, structured and methodical system of repression that has been working smoothly and mercilessly for months on end. Al Hassan does not have the impression that he's done anything wrong. As for the victims, P0554, Madou Traoré, Dedeu Maïga, P0565, and others, all those who have appeared before this court, clearly understood the tremendous harm done unto them. The people of Timbuktu are exhausted. They have suffered tremendous harm. You will give them justice, no more and no less. You will do so courageously, and you will hand down a minimum of 22 years imprisonment, Your Honours.
Merci, Monsieur Duterte.
Thank you, Mr. Duterte.
For their submissions and for staying rightly within their time frame. Turn now to the legal representatives of victims. Monsieur Sita, you have the floor. I remind you that for your submissions you have 30 minutes to be divided as you see fit.
Oui. Madame la juge présidente.
Yes. Thank you, Judge. Thank you for offering me the floor. And I would also like to thank you for that reminder that you've just given us regarding the time which has been allotted to us. But I would ask the court to be indulgent and to check with my colleague, Mr. Kasongo, who is attending remotely, whether he can indeed hear us at this point in time and whether he can indeed take the floor, because that will be necessary. He too will speak as a member of our team. I'm not sure if it's the court officer who might want to check that, but I'd like to ascertain whether Mr. Kasongo is in a position to speak, whether his microphone is working. Thank you.
I see that the court officer is checking whether that's possible, but I don't want to lose a lot of time with this, Monsieur Sita, so hopefully we can clarify this quickly.
Je pense que je vous entends.
Mr. Kasongo, yes, I can hear you.
He hears, he can hear, so let's proceed, Monsieur Sita.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la juge présidente.
Yes, thank you, Your Honour.
Voilà, je commencerai donc de brèves observations compte tenu
I just have two brief comments in light of the limited time allocated to us by the Chamber. And then Mr. Kasongo, who has just spoken up, shall speak in turn, and Mr. Sedou Doumbia shall close as regards the observations of the legal representatives of the victims at this hearing. Now, the prosecution's presentation this morning put forward or presented a factor which is key to our approach on behalf of the legal representatives of victims when it comes to what we are presenting to you today. As regards, aside from the individual harm suffered by the individuals, there is also a collective aspect when it comes to the harm suffered as regards the crime suffered.
The prosecutor was using the term abuse in Timbuktu and the disdain for the culture in Timbuktu, a population which was entirely terrorized. Women,
girls who were particularly targeted.
Cet aspect collectif,
Now, this collective aspect
collectif plutôt, du préjudice
of harm
plusieurs sectes.
presents several different aspects. The population of Timbuktu, the entire population, first of all, and then there was the group, including women,
Du fait de leurs conditions.
and the fact of their condition.
Au sein de ces femmes,
And as women, and then among these women, there were those
dans des circonstances
who were in circumstances or in
la répression
circumstances that was felt to justify the repression that was set up, either due to their arrest for not having respected the new rules or because of
représentées pour
other issues they represented for these people. They were used for forced marriage or for a series of other motives
ressenties comme
which are still felt
une profonde source d'injustice.
as a profound source of injustice, because, as the prosecutor recalled, the judgment specified that there were specific prohibitions and bans which were put on women, and they were impacted, and that impact was negative on all aspects of the life of the women in Timbuktu. And beyond the public observations and submissions that we have made here, I would like to express the concerns of the victims with regards to the aspects that I have just mentioned. And I would like to be as faithful as possible to the meetings that we've had, although albeit limited due to the deadlines imposed by the Chamber. Now, we went to our clients towards the end of July in order to inform them of the content of the judgment and the follow-up of the proceedings, and to collect their concerns with regards to the sentence. And during these meetings, we heard mainly from women who, in various ways, still bear the scars of what happened and who struggle every day to provide for their families. A significant number of the participating victims were women. They expressed their astonishment, their sadness, and even their anger at the fact that all the charges relating to gender crimes had been dropped, because despite the findings of the Chamber and of a certain majority, none of the crimes specifically targeting women had resulted in conviction. Not even gender-based persecution. We have also heard from many displaced persons who are struggling to provide education or indeed simply decent living conditions for their children in an attempt to recover from their forced exile. At each meeting, we heard from people who thirst for justice, just justice, that actually takes into account the key role played by Mr. Al Hassan in the commission of crimes during the occupation of Timbuktu from April 2012 to January 2013. We were struck by how incredulous the victims were to learn of the gap between what they felt they had contributed to the process of establishing the truth and what had resulted in the judgment. Their feeling of incomprehension is considerable and should be relayed to you as it reverberates in the victims' views of what here would constitute a just sentence. And as we pointed out in our submissions, indeed the victims, with regards to their experience, consider that the sentence of life is the sentence which would be required, but taking into account all the treatment beyond the analysis of what was made of the judges, they asked themselves the question, what can the just sentence be? How can the victims receive? How can there be a fair sentence for the victims when there were complex aspects in the trial which they were asked to put their trust in, and they accepted to participate, and it led to an acquittal with regards to traumatic crimes? Of course, acquittal is one of the possible outcomes of any criminal trial, and the victims have been informed of the issues at stake in this trial and how proof is established. However, this case is a very particular case, and it is the challenge, for example, is not improving the crimes were committed and that the convicted person was responsible for them. None of this is being challenged, but rather there is a series of procedural contortions which have devastating effects for the victims. Not even the convictions for torture or persecution on religious grounds can assuage their amazement at the judgment. And it is in this context that the victims' reflections on the sentencing have necessarily been hijacked by a profound sense of injustice, even betrayal. Presiding Judge, Your Honours, the second point that I would like to address is that of apologies, or more precisely, the request for forgiveness. We have heard at length the prosecutor, and we subscribe to everything that the prosecutor said in this regard, and of course we share the concerns of the victims. Exchanges with the victims have shown that there's a distinction which is explicit or implicit between the position to adopt in the face of a convicted criminal who simply requests forgiveness and one who also admits doing wrong. If Mr. Al Hassan sincerely intends to request to be pardoned, as he says he does, without addressing the reasons for his actions that he carried out, the victims will continue to question the sincerity of the apology and compare it with the fact that Mr. Ahmed al-Faki al-Mahdi, for example, that his situation was different. For a number of the victims represented, discussing the sentence led them to try to understand why, beyond presenting a request for forgiveness, there was no admission. There was no admission of the nature of his conduct or an expression of remorse for the wrong that was done. These musings by the victims are all the more legitimate given the fact that the person convicting himself said that he was aware of taking actions that violated Sharia and that therefore he must have been aware that these acts were unlawful. Of course, any request for forgiveness will have to be the subject of more in-depth discussions with the victims. But at this stage, 2 points are highlighted by them. Any request for forgiveness can only be accepted if responsibility has been established, if the judges have said what crimes were committed, and if a just sentence has been handed down. And here I refer back to my first point. And consequently, this is my second and final point. The victims believe that at this stage, the sentence should be determined independently of the attitude or commitments, however sincere, of the convicted person to forgive. Madam President, Madam Judge, Your Honour, when you make your decision under Article 76 of the Rome Statute and decide on the applicable sentence in this case, the victims ask you to take particular account of the scale of the damage, which concerns the population of a town the prosecutor has ceaselessly repeated the impact that it had on the town of Timbuktu. And this act of occupation of Timbuktu, and to take into account the fact that this is a population of a town as a whole, and whose consequences will not stop with the generation that has lived through the events. I would like to stress this point, and I thank you. I will now give the floor over to Maître Kasongo to continue with the observations. Thank you, Mr. Sita. Mr. Kasongo.
Merci.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to Mr. Sita. I would like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank the Chamber to have given us the floor. And above all, I wish to extend my greetings to the presiding judge and the other judges of this chamber, as well as the representatives of the parties and participants. I shall speak for a shorter period of time.
Je tiens à signaler que je vais intervenir sur 3 points.
I shall be making 3 points. First of all, providing additional information to supplement what Mr. Sita said. He has given information about how we have proceeded in framing the observations and views of the victims. I shall be summarizing the steps which we have taken, and I shall also be further underlining inaudible. Speaker is breaking up. I want to relate to you that the victims wish to see a heavy sentence handed down. First of all, why were the steps which we took necessary? Well, simply because we wanted to be able to relay to you the concerns of the victims at this stage of the proceedings. We visited the victims, myself with Mr. Sita and Mr. Doumbia, to visit the victims who were located in 3 different countries. We brought together the victims at the 3-country point where the borders meet. There was one group which constituted the women. We put a question to them, which I shall now relay to you, and we heard their responses. And then we had another group where we put the same matters to separately.
Beaucoup plus leurs enfants hier en même temps et l'ensemble de la collectivité.
Inaudible. Teenagers and children and political players. Our question was, what are your expectations of the chamber when it comes to sentencing? Do you want a very heavy sentence, a moderate sentence, or a light sentence? Without going into the details, the victims in the women's group were a lot more severe in their views. I think that represented their state of mind. They felt that the sentence should not be lower than the maximum. The women that we spoke with referred to the gravity of the harm done in Timbuktu. Those who had not been subjected to the same acts did not share the same degree of shock, interpretation by the interpreter. Inaudible.
It seems we seem to have lost the signal, or at least there's some technical problem. Mr. Registrar.
So the connection is still.
It appears that there's a technical issue on the other end of the communication. Mr. Sita, perhaps we should proceed to Mr. Dumbia's submissions and then see if there's anything final from Mr. Kansanga if we have sufficient time. That's what I would propose.
Oui, c'est à ça que je pensais aussi.
Mr. Sita. Yes, indeed, I was thinking the exact same, Your Honour. Let us proceed in that way. Mr. Doumbia, if you are ready, please do take the floor now.
Mr. Doumbia, can you hear us, and are you able to make your intervention, please?
Oui, je vous entends.
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente, honorable juge, bonjour.
Good afternoon, Your Honour, Your Honours.
Je suis du terrain et
I
je
am
voudrais
in the
partager
field
avec vous
and
quelques
I would
échos
like to share
de ce terrain
certain echoes coming from the field relating to the victims that we met over the last days.
Ces propos
The words
sont recueillis sur quelques
we have gathered from several victims, I would say approximately a dozen of
résument
them.
en quelque sorte
They summarize to a certain degree
là qui participent à cette procédure
what the victims feel who participate in the proceedings, and they
profondes aspirations
refer their great hopes to the judges with regards to the final outcome of this trial.
La première victime
The first victim,
expose son cri de cœur
who gives
de la manière
their
suivante.
heartfelt plea in the following way. She says,
Vu la gravité des faits,
with regards to the gravity of the
Al-Hassan
case, Al Hassan
mérite de rester en prison
deserves
pendant
to stay
longtemps
in prison
encore
for a long time still,
pour qu'il réfléchisse sur ce qu'il a fait
so that he may reflect on what he's done to the population of Timbuktu.
Si on nous le donne aujourd'hui,
If
il ne
today
verra pas le jour. S'il ne demande pas
If he
pardon
doesn't ask
sincèrement,
sincerely
alors
for pardon,
qu'il reste en prison
then he
pendant
will
le reste
stay
de sa vie.
in prison for the rest of his life.
Une deuxième victime
A second victim
nous fait part
expresses
de ses aspirations profondes.
the profound hopes they have.
Dit,
She says,
il y a toujours des groupes armés dans
"Th-
Sardine
there are always armed groups, Ansardine,
qui terrorisent les
who
gens
are
au
still
nord de
terrorizing
Mali.
people in the north of Mali.
Nous savons ce qui se passe
We know what's happening in Timbuktu
par l'intermédiaire de nos
via
parents
intermediaries,
qui sont
our
restés.
relatives who have stayed there.
Vu les informations que nous avons, que nous recueillons,
From the information that we have gathered, the population of Timbuktu is still not ready to pardon Al Hassan.
les populations qui sont restées vivent dans la misère.
The population that remains is still in misery, poverty, because of this painful past.
Ces gens sont détruits et dévastés.
These people have been destroyed, devastated.
Les populations
The
risquent de se
population
soulever
risks rising up, seeing them come to Timbuktu. They could be resigned if they are prevented from reacting, but they will not pardon ever. They will not forgive ever. A third victim said the following: I think that he has to be kept for the amount of time until he is no longer able to take up the acts again which he's in prison for. If not, the relatives who are still in place will continue to suffer from his misdeeds. In all cases, certain injustices, it is the case that justice must decide what is necessary for him. He must be sanctioned in terms of the gravity of the acts he has committed, the impact of the acts that he committed with regard to the victims who must receive reparations. And a fourth victim states the following: for me, he must spend the rest of his life in prison because the real problems that he caused are still there. We're suffering from the same problems. So the time that he's already spent in prison is not sufficient. The misdeeds of these people, their crimes, are extended everywhere, and they must repair the harm that they have done. A human being cannot just get up one morning and persecute an entire population, mutilate people, flog them, rape them, and think that just a few years are enough afterwards. For those who have suffered harm, must obtain just reparations, those who have been harmed. And a fifth person said, we're not ready to forgive. He must spend the rest of his life in prison. That would not bother us at all. They've taken away everything that we held most great: our dignity, our honor, our goods, our animals. Stigmatization of women who are victims of rape and other sexual violence continues. And the children who are born out of these forced marriages are treated as if they were rebels. Some of our brothers have disappeared since 2013. We don't know if they're alive or not. Another victim states, if Al Hassan went to the north today, the population would not pardon him, and particularly because he was acquitted of certain charges. A few charges do not make it possible to whitewash his criminal acts that he caused. Another victim states to us, we cannot forget what he did. The reason why we cannot forgive, and neither can our children. If he comes to us, we cannot bear him. What Al Hassan did is not comparable with what others did to us.
Une autre victime nous a partagé ceci.
Another victim shared with us the following. To this very day, the armed groups Ansardine and Akim are still there. They are still there. But they are just more dispersed. I left Timbuktu the day before yesterday. Once I returned, they could be eliminated, and members of they could be eliminated by members of the Al Sardine group. There's a lot of secrets of these jihadists. Today, the evidence is that the group of jihadists are trying to kill people. And what Al Hassan deserves is to stay in prison because he made us suffer a lot. Another victim states, I'm sorry to put it like this, but the Red Cross never pardon. But the Reds can never pardon. Even if Al Hassan is liberated, he is banned from Timbuktu. He will always be there, inaudible. Members of his group who will still be in Timbuktu. But he will always have his radar, his roots, the members of his group who will still be in place. He's a leader. And if he returns tomorrow, he will have followers who are ready to follow him. And he can still build up the same group around him. He still has influence among the population. There's another victim who says, when your father was killed by a serpent, you are scared of a black rope. Even if Al Hassan is allowed among the population, who everybody will be uneasy because of vengeance and desolation, inaudible. Because the harm has already been done. So what will be the result of this case? The population can never forget what has been done to their own property. And for his own good, it's best that he stays in prison. Your Honour, honourable judges, I had to share these few words, quoting directly the victims, in order to illustrate the extent to which the pain is still very much present among the Timbuktu population. And not only them, a lot of people are not in Timbuktu, but they still have the same feeling. They are living the effects of the past. Their only concern today, as one of the victims stated, is never, ever to meet Al Hassan across their path again, because the victim said, if in the future Al Hassan had to be in Timbuktu, then I would ask justice to go and live elsewhere. Your Honour.
Sorry to interrupt you, but your time is up, so please bring your submissions to a conclusion. Thank you.
Yes, I'm just going to finish, and this was the final sentence that I wanted to say. I would just say to you that the feeling of the population today is that they have their hopes in the justice. They believe in it firmly, and they believe that justice will be rendered. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you very much for your submissions. I'm sorry the technical problems continue to exist with Mr. Kasanga, and in any event, the time frame has been exceeded. But I thank the legal representatives of victims for the submissions that have been provided to the Chamber. Thank you very much. I turn now to the defense. Ms. Taylor, you can commence your submissions, and of course, as with the others, you're free to divide the submissions up as you see fit, and including those which we have authorized specifically. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And if it would assist, we would have no objection to the submissions of Mr. Kasongo being filed so that they're not prejudiced through technical errors, if that's of any assistance.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor.
Madam President, Your Honours, in 2012, Al Hassan was not a politician. He was not a soldier. He did not choose a life of conflict. He did not choose to bear the heavy responsibilities of fatherhood in a dark and difficult time. He is now being convicted for the choices he made, and he has in turn sought the forgiveness of the persons he harmed, the people in Timbuktu, for those choices. And we are standing before you, speaking on his behalf to ask that you exercise your discretion fairly and humanely. In so doing, I will address you in relation to the difficult context in which Mr. Al Hassan's conduct occurred, and I will explain how that shaped and constrained his choices. I will further explain why the assistance he rendered to the people of Timbuktu warrants lenience. A reduced sentence is also proportionate to the reduced nature of his knowledge and contributions. Maître Bolo-Lucier will address the relevance of Mr. Al Hassan's personal circumstances to the Chamber's duty to craft a sentence that is proportionate in light of the totality of his circumstances. Maître Sethi will address the specific arguments raised by the prosecution and Victims' Counsel concerning gravity and aggravating circumstances. And I would like to draw your attention to the fact that we did indeed submit a table of authorities. Annex A is the list of legal authorities and evidential citations that will be referred to by myself and my two colleagues. Annex B refers to the prosecution's submissions and then cross-references to the trial judgment's headings, which are color-coded. This is an operation that the Chamber will be required to do. They will be required to assess whether there's double counting, and given the interest of a speedy judgment, we have effectively performed that for you, if it is of assistance. Annex C lists the specific paragraphs in the prosecution submissions which rely on findings for which Mr. Al Hassan was in fact acquitted. And we brought this to the attention of the prosecutor last Wednesday and asked him to file a corrigendum, and in the absence of one, I will address this in my submissions.
Ms. Taylor, if I could just, on that issue, this material was not authorized by the Chamber to be filed. It's not a concept known in the submissions before the court. You're free to refer to this material, but understand that the Chamber's not taking this into account as filed submissions or either written or oral. So you make use of it as you wish, but it is not material that is in front of the Chamber as submissions that have been presented in accordance with the directions of the Chamber. But feel free. I don't want to interrupt your submissions. Please proceed. You can make the references as you wish, but that's the position of the Chamber. So please proceed with your submissions, your oral submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. Now, Mr. Al Hassan was acquitted of half the charges and over half the charged incidents in this case. But although he was acquitted of gender persecution, rape, and forced marriage, the prosecution and the victim submissions are still predicated on the harm caused by those crimes. And they have asked him to be sentenced and punished for crimes for which he was found innocent. Now, we have listed that for you in Annex C, a snapshot, but obviously you are free to go through that in more detail to see the extent to which, both today and last week, their sentence is predicated on an acquittal. And they have ignored these acquittals because their submissions have targeted the groups Ansar Dine and Al-Qaeda, not Al Hassan. But today in this courtroom, the role of the chamber is not to punish Al-Qaeda or Ansar Dine, nor is it to punish Sharia. Your role is to determine the limits of a fair and just sentence for Mr. Al Hassan. And when you enter a conviction, you assess conduct. But when you enter a sentence, you have to consider the man behind that conduct. The man sitting behind me, a father, a husband, a torture survivor. And when you assess his conduct, I would like you to bear in mind the following. In the region of Brabant, the Netherlands, there's a statue erected in honor of a German called Karl Heinz. He was an 18-year-old conscript stationed in occupied Netherlands. When the village he was stationed in came under shelling, he rescued 2 Dutch children, he brought them to their mother in the cellar, and then when he emerged, he in turn was killed by a shell. On the plaque is the tribute. It honors all those who do good in evil times. And the plaque does not honor this individual because he was a good person, nor does it assert that everything he did was good. What it honors is in that split second when he heard the sound of shells, instead of running to protect himself, he stayed and protected others. In a difficult and dark situation, he made things better by staying and doing an act of good. As armchair historians or lawyers in The Hague, it's easy to speculate about what one could do or should do when faced with moral and legal conundrums faced by people in dark and difficult times. But as judges, tasked with a heavy role of punishment and sentence, your role requires you to put yourself into the shoes of Mr. Al Hassan, to see things through his eyes. And while you have found Mr. Al Hassan culpable of these crimes, we ask you to grant him lenience for his efforts to do acts of good, to achieve restraint through his role in dark and difficult times, which he played no role in bringing about. In 2012, he was a married man with a baby boy, a daughter on the way. As the eldest son, he was responsible for his elderly parents and his family as a whole. His father, a former veterinarian, was retired. It's at T94, page 40. The trial chamber recognized in its judgment that Mr. Al Hassan may have generally faced a danger from the Malian army, and this was based on their findings at paragraph 411. So let's look closely at the nature of this risk. D605, a young Tuareg was threatened with death when he was in Bamako. Incidentally, D534, also stationed near Bamako, was also threatened with death. D240 gave evidence that the routes between Bamako and the north were very dangerous because they were controlled by the Malian army. Fleeing to Bamako was not an option for Mr. Al Hassan and his family. The chamber also heard evidence from D540 concerning how difficult it was to flee to Mauritania. He tried. He had to give up because it was too arduous for his aunt. D211's parents did flee to Mauritania, and they had to do so riding donkeys. It took them a long time, and when they arrived, they had to sleep under trees in the open air. Drinking water was scarce and very expensive, and there was no medicine. The chamber also heard from prosecution witness 1086, who gave evidence that the 2 Tuaregs in his convoy were brutally killed en route to Mauritania. Now, if you put yourself in his shoes, if you had a pregnant wife, a young son, very little means and money, would you risk taking that route only to end up in a camp, sleeping in open air under such conditions? So Mr. Al Hassan stayed in Mali. So what was he supposed to do to survive? His pharmacy shut down, and the situation of insecurity had cut his supply of medicines. The situation in Zoho was austere, and there was not much there, as testified by D627, D803, and D243. Mr. Al Hassan had to travel to and from Timbuktu to get necessary supplies, as there was no employment in Zoho itself. When the groups first arrived in Timbuktu, Al Hassan went to the MNLA. He went to the airport to try to find work, but they didn't want him because he didn't have a weapon. They sent him back to Timbuktu. And at this point, he only had 200,000 CFA to his name. That's a total of around 300 euros, which he was hoping to save to use to escape with his family. And this is in his statement. He therefore tried to make money selling light weapons to local Arab traders. Obviously not a good idea. When doing so, his cousin, who was already working with the Islamists, told Al Hassan that he had to come with him to the military camp to meet the leaders of Ansar Dine. Tu dois partir avec moi, is what he was told. There, he was brought before Ansar Dine leaders who convinced him of the obligation, the necessity of working with the group. And even then, his first instinct was to seek to work for the hospital, to use his medical skills to help people. And his request to do so was rejected. He was brought directly to the police by Sheikh Abdallah, where he was told that he would work as an interpreter because of his language skills. Al Hassan ended up at the police after first exhausting at least 3 other alternatives, and after having been convinced of the obligation of accepting this work. This is not the trajectory of a zealot. This is a path of desperation. In its judgment, the Chamber referred to 2 examples of persons who were asked to work for Ansar Dine and refused. This is P557 and P638. But after turning down this offer, P557 left Timbuktu, leaving his wife and child behind him. P638, who was young and single, fled to Mauritania several times, including with the help of a Westerner with means. Al Hassan's reluctance to do the same, to leave his pregnant wife, infant son, and elderly parents, it warrants your lenience, your understanding, not a heavy sentence. The Chambers also found that Mr. Al Hassan's explanation of the context in which he joined Ansar Dine was consistent with the evidence of close associates who knew him at the time. So what did these associates say? D211 confirmed that there were no other jobs available for people who did not have pre-existing work or business. It was also not possible for a Tuareg to stay in Timbuktu without being either associated or protected by one of the groups. D211 further testified that Al Hassan told him that Ansar Dine was the most powerful force present. And he then said, half the people in the city are foreigners and not from the local population, and that if we, the local population, stay out of Ansar Dine, we would wind up being unable to defend our neighbours, our acquaintances, and our brothers. It was not religion, it was not money, it was not hatred, but love for his neighbours, acquaintances, the locals who were his brothers, who needed his protection. That's what drove Al Hassan to join Ansar Dine. Similarly, according to D43, Hassan told me one of the reasons he joined Ansar Dine was to protect his family and to protect the people in Timbuktu. And it was because of him that people were able to stay in Timbuktu at this time. And both D243 and D272 further testified that Mr. Al Hassan's protection extended beyond the Kelansar tribe, or indeed Tuaregs, to many locals of different ethnicities. So yes, when Al Hassan hit a wall regarding options to protect his family, he was convinced of the necessity of working with Ansar Dine, but he used his position to help the local population. In our written submissions, we cite several examples where Mr. Al Hassan used his position to help the population in a non-discriminatory manner. And this attitude of lenience and good deeds was not restricted to Al Hassan's own actions. He also used his position to counsel others to do the same. P582 confirmed this. At footnote 2668 of the judgment, the Chamber cites his evidence that Al Hassan counselled him to interpret in a manner that favoured the local population. P582 also gave evidence that Al Hassan reprimanded a police officer called Bilal, who had fired his weapon near a local. Bilal was disciplined for this and then left and joined Mujal. D605 also testified that Al Hassan advised him to always use restraint and calm with the local population. Along with Sander, Al Hassan assisted in bringing a police officer who raped a local woman to justice. This context should inform the way the Chamber assesses P150's self-serving evidence that the leaders were happy with Al Hassan and praised Al Hassan because he was strict in comparison to Al-Mahdi. Now, we have no date for this conversation between P150 and the leaders, and we have no examples of conduct that this supposedly refers to. But we do know that first, Al Hassan was strict. He was strict on members of the police, whose actions threatened to harm the local population. Second, we know that the leaders of Ansar Dine and ACME favoured maintaining respectful and peaceful relationships with the local population, as you found in footnotes 1252 and par 466. So the only reasonable interpretation of the sentiment that the leaders were pleased with Al Hassan is that this was because he helped them to rein in and restrain anyone who seemed likely to harm the local population. And he also did so by resolving disputes in a peaceful manner, as you found. Similarly, the trial chamber can place no weight on prosecution submissions concerning Mr. Al Hassan possessing or bearing a weapon. There was only one instance where the chamber found that Mr. Al Hassan had a weapon. This was the execution of Musa, which is not a charged crime. And this one example cannot be used to extrapolate a broader finding for the purposes of ascertaining his sentence for the charged crimes. You have the videos, you've seen the punishments for which Mr. Al Hassan was convicted, and you can see that he did not have a weapon at those crimes. The circumstances of Musa are also completely opposite to the crimes for which Mr. Al Hassan was convicted. Musa was a member of Ansar Dine, not a civilian. He accepted to be judged in accordance with Sharia. Al Hassan even asked Musa, why not flee? And Musa's response was that he could flee from humans, but not from God. And that's in Mr. Al Hassan's interview records with the prosecutor. Musa was not a flight risk, and Al Hassan knew that. Musa was his friend, and also Al Hassan was there to support him, having failed to save him. Al Hassan's nudges, his prods in the direction of lenience did not always succeed. His efforts to save Musa from execution did not succeed. The Islamic Tribunal did not accept the allegations in the police report that a particular victim had been raped by her stepbrother. But he tried, and he did so at risk to himself. In a sermon, Qutayba, the chief religious leader of Akim, warned that once the police or Hezbollah receive a complaint of adultery, theft, or drunkenness, it was forbidden to interfere with the process in any way inconsistent with God's will. Any attempt to do so would be cursed by Allah. The evidence shows that while Al Hassan did what he could to help the local population through subtle interpretations and prods in the way of lenience, he also felt constrained from open defiance. When Al Hassan told the prosecution that the people were scared of the punishments, there was nothing he could do, he was also referring to himself. This constraint, this fear of retaliation, is reflected in the way he reacted to the arrest of his uncle, who was caught stealing weapons from Ansar Deen. When the prosecutor asked Al Hassan about this incident, they also inquired whether the arrest happened before or after the flogging of Hussein al-Badi. Like Al Hassan's uncle, Hussein al-Badi was also a member of the group who had broken the rules. Al Hassan told the prosecutor that was afterwards, and that was why Al Hassan was scared. Al Hassan was scared. Scared what would happen if he, as a member of the group, or his uncle, or anyone else, broke the rules. And this is in his interview records. So even with his uncle, a close relative, Al Hassan did what he could to help, not by resisting, not by defying, but by participating. Specifically, Al Hassan asked the emir of the police if Al Hassan could be the one to arrest his uncle, to ensure that his uncle would not be beaten. Ultimately, it was his cousin, not Al Hassan, who was able to achieve his uncle's pardon, as Al Hassan himself could not. And that was Al Hassan's modus operandi. He used his presence, he used his participation to achieve protection, lenience, and restraint. And this, Your Honours, deserves lenience and restraint in turn. Now, the reason why I am focusing on this context is because the context necessarily informs your sentence. Typically, individuals who collaborate under difficult circumstances and pressures are treated with lenience, particularly if they use their position to help when and where they can. And in your judgment, you recognized that Al Hassan was someone who tried to help in difficult times. Paragraph 1070. And this finding extended beyond a member of his tribe, beyond his friends. You found that it extended to locals who simply knew him. Madam President, Your Honours, true deterrence is achieved by targeting the drivers of the occupation, not individuals swept up by its wake who are simply doing their best to keep their head above water by trying to help others to do the same. This precept has shaped sentencing practices concerning locals who accept similar functionary positions in difficult times. After World War II, Israel started prosecuting Jewish collaborators. There were about 40 such prosecutions. The average sentence was 17 months. The highest, 10 years, for Joseph Pal, who was convicted for persecution entailing numerous acts of physical violence. In these cases, the defendants were tried by the community which had suffered, which understood the context in which the defendants acted. And this framework was articulated by the Supreme Court in the Berenblatt case. And they said, "Men take care of themselves and their families, and the prohibitions of criminal law, they were not written for exceptional heroes, but for ordinary mortals with ordinary weaknesses." The High Court Council of Timbuktu and D553 have asked the same thing of this bench. They are asking you to see things from their perspective. Al Hassan was not one of the directors of the group. He was not with them when they came in on the 1st or 2nd of April when they installed their system. He was a local who, like many others, were swept up in its wake. Madam President, it's 1 o'clock. Is a good time to break for the lunch?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Taylor. I was hoping for an appropriate pause, so we will, the chamber will, we will adjourn at this point until 2 p.m. So we're taking a shortened break to ensure that we can finish within the timeframes today. So we're adjourned until 2 p.m.
All rise, we will away.